All right. Well, let's get started here. Just sort of testing this angle and all that stuff. But I just want to do a little bit of a review of, or an introduction to Two Kingdom thinking. And then in that context, or maybe I should say it the other way around, in the context of reviewing the book by Van Drunen, Politics After Christendom, that'll be our window into the Two Kingdom view. So um, it's not going to be comprehensive, and any treatment of these things could be criticized on that ground. You know, why didn't you cover this? Or hey, that's not fair because so and so says this in this other book. Well, you could pretty much do that for any view, and no critique could ever get off the ground. So this is just an introduction. So take it that way, and don't criticize it on that basis. Well, you got to take into account all this more. Um, that sometimes could be valid, but as I said, it's just an introduction. Um, this is new for a lot of people. You get the question all the time, what is Two Kingdom? What is that? Uh, is it a heresy? And then others, of course, those who would defend it would say, no, it's historical. And that's really the first thing we can cover is it is historical language in the sense that authors have used the language of two kingdoms. And in fact, that's not just Luther and Calvin and reformers, but you could cite Augustine as using those words. What we're going to see, though, is that that's not a fair argument because Augustine certainly did not mean the same thing by the two kingdoms that he talked about. And in fact, that's really the first thing that I'll put on the board because I think it's easy to describe. What's not going to be easy is me turning around to this board. So I'll see if I could even do it. But at any rate, when Augustine did this, it was sort of left to right. You had in Genesis 3:15 and forward, that's just a marker for us, two cities, the city of God and the heavenly city and the earthly city. You could draw that like this with a line, with one city up here, heavenly, and the other city down here, earthly. The problem with that, and I think that is where two kingdom advocates today will reach back and say, yeah, that. Because one's the church or the covenant of grace or spiritual things and so forth, and the other is not. Sure, we participate in that, and that really is first clue as to some of the problem there. But again, you could point back and say, well, let me explain to you what I mean by that's not what Augustine meant. Because what Augustine was getting at was that you had the city of God, which starts with God and his angels and the elect, but it flows downward here. We're pilgrims in this city, and right there the two kingdom people again will say, yes, that's our point. We're just pilgrims passing through and so forth. Now, again, if you're not exposed to this, you're like, I'm totally lost. I don't know what the disagreement's about. But the clearest way to say that's not what Augustine meant is to say that one city was really about the people, the roster, to use a sports word, the roster of people who were the elect versus the roster of people who were not. It was not about spheres in society, labor versus family versus church versus state. That's not how Augustine was dividing things. He did have a category for the temporal versus the eternal and that pilgrimage, but it is simply untrue and a twisting of his language to say that the two kingdom view for today is meaning the same thing that Augustine did. Because Augustine is talking about, and if you doubt that, look at some of the chapter headings in the City of God, where it talks about the two cities driven by two different loves, headed by two different princes, and so forth, going off to two different destinies. It's just abundantly clear that Augustine is talking about the people of God versus the people who follow the prince of the power of the air. if you want to put it in that Ephesians 2 language. So no, this isn't about dividing spheres in terms of legitimate Christian activity versus illegitimate activity for Christians. It just was not the category that Augustine was working with. Okay, now we're Luther and Calvin. Fast forwarding, of course, skipping the medieval period altogether, but we're just trying to make some broad points here, okay? Did they mean that? And we'll talk a little bit about the Reformed tradition, because at times Luther and Calvin did. Luther was inconsistent. Calvin was a bit inconsistent as well. And in both of their cases, their inconsistencies were often driven by historical expediencies, whether in Wittenberg or in Geneva. But that's another story for another time. That doesn't so much concern us here. But what is going on with the two kingdom view? Well, Keith Matheson gives a basic definition. He was giving a bit of a book review of one of Van Druenen's earlier books, which is the more user-friendly one, because there's two other scholarly ones on natural law and the two kingdoms and things like that. And I'm not talking about those. And again, that's a criticism that can come in. Well, you've got to deal with those. But you can't deal with everything all at once. Okay. And so anyway, Matheson's given this review of the, what was that first one called? Living in God's Two Kingdoms, I believe was the name of it. But anyway, so Matheson says this, giving a bit of a definition. He says, quote, proponents of two kingdoms theology assert that Christians live in two kingdoms. They live in a common kingdom consisting of the entire human race, which was established by God in his covenant with Noah. Let me write this on the board. And let's start at Genesis 9, because that's where Van Druenen's going to start in that sense. Okay, so Genesis 9 right here, God makes a covenant with Noah. And when God makes the covenant with Noah, who's it with? It's with the whole human race. And so we're going to draw a sphere. The problem is I'm drawing it right away. So it's not going to be what the two kingdom people are talking about. So let's not do that. Let's draw just a smaller circle right here that God makes a covenant with the whole human race. We can call it earthly. We can call it whatever. Let's call it secular. I think both views can agree that that word is not a dirty word in and of itself. It just means this time and this place. Okay, so let's get back to Matheson's definition. Proponents of the two kingdoms theology assert that Christians live in two kingdoms. They live in a common kingdom. I should write that word. So if you don't like secular, write common. That's fine. Okay. Consisting of the entire human race, which was established by God in his covenant with Noah. They also live in a redemptive kingdom, consisting of God's chosen people, a kingdom that was formally established by God in his covenant with Abraham. God rules both kingdoms, but in different ways. Okay, now let's put another circle over here, and let's put, do you want to put, the word that's usually coupled with this is sacred. Let's put spiritual, a little bit more of a common word to us here. And the word that Matheson uses opposed to common is redemptive. So let's put redemptive over here. And let's do this. Let's put Noah right here, receiving this from God, and Abraham at Genesis 12 and 15 and 17 receiving that. So those two circles represent those two kingdoms. Now, they're going to say, and we would agree with them about this, that God rules over God himself. In fact, I wish I had a different color for this. So these lines are coming from God, these ones on the outside. This is just referring to his revelation and his ordination. But these are referring to his rule and his reign, which is going to cover all. So we and two kingdom advocates would agree that God rules over both. Now, we're already disagreeing about where these lines are, so we have to understand that right away. But just basic definition. If it seems like we're moving too slow and we're like, and you're still like, well, it doesn't fill out the whole picture for me, that's a good thing. We're going to go slow because a lot of people don't even know what this is. Okay, so a distinction. Matheson adds to that in that same article that's reviewing that book, quote, the main point of potential disagreement concerns how the ascension of Christ to the right hand of God affected his reign over the unbelieving nations in this present time between the first and second advents. So now I'm going to cheat a little bit, but not really. Hopefully you'll be able to appreciate this. If all I was doing was going left to right, what Matheson just mentioned would like fly right off the board, because this is Genesis 9, 12. We'd have to go way over there to give you Matthew 28. So what I'm going to do, not just for convenience sake, but for accuracy, I'm going to pull that over here because these two circles still exist. Let me get a different color. And I'm going to pull this line of Matthew 28, and I'll put it right here, 28:18. And that's just a marker. Of course, Peter at Pentecost in Acts 2, you could see that as a coronation sermon where Christ ascended to the throne, fulfilled the Davidic throne and all that stuff. I'm an amillennialist, and that's one of the reasons why. You don't have to be at this point. But by the way, people that bring this up, the two kingdom advocates are typically amillennial, giving amillennialism a bad name. Augustine was amillennial, and he wouldn't have had any of this. But at any rate, so I'm pulling that over here. And what does Matheson say now? He said in that last quotation, the main point of potential disagreement concerns how the ascension of Christ to the right hand of God affected his reign over the unbelieving nations in this present time between first and second advent. First advent. So really, this is over here. Second advent over here. Christ returns. His kingdom is inaugurated. He's on his throne. So God now, through Christ, now you have to understand, Reformed people make a distinction about Christ's reign. And that distinction is what's called the essential reign of Christ versus what is called the mediatorial reign of Christ. There's not two Christs on two thrones, but there are two natures and therefore two senses in which Christ reigns. I mean, you've had the practical question before. Well, if Christ is God and God already owns everything, what's all this talk in the Bible about God giving a kingdom and nations to the Son, or the Son presenting that kingdom back to God? Well, what is any of that all about? Well, that's the human nature of Christ. But that doesn't settle this question, because then there is this distinction between the essential reign, which is that reign by which the eternal Son, by virtue of his divine person, reigns and rules together with the Father and the Holy Spirit. What does he reign over? He reigns over everything. So he reigns over the political too. He reigns over everything. In the Noahic covenant, two kingdom advocates will agree with us about that. Okay, but then there's the mediatorial reign of Christ, which two kingdom escadito amillennialists will restrict to his reign over the church in this time. Now, as the mediatorial king, that's true in that he is head of the church, Colossians 1:18. But Paul says he's head over all things in Ephesians 1:20-23 for the church. And of course, in that very verse, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. So the human Christ, not the divine Son of God, which we all agree, the essential reign, but some authority has been given to him as human king at his inaugurated kingdom over not just the church. So Matthew 28:18 is a tremendous problem for the two kingdom view. That's all me talking. Don't put that on Matheson. He's just drawing attention to where the first disagreement is. You might look at this and say, how can this be a doctrine of Christ issue? So Christology and eschatology. I thought we were talking about politics here. Well, we are, but how you think about Christology and eschatology is going to determine your ethics and your ecclesiology too, and how your doctrine of the church intersects with your understanding of ethics. So those are just some basic theological beginnings to all this. Now, before we wrap it up on our first session, let's do what might seem like a little bit of